Republicans and recessions actually have a lot more in common than people realize, and this is about to get really interesting. US recessions started when a Republican was in office. So since 1969, you can see on the screen here, there's pressure on the Fed to lower interest rates. And the president is really supposed to stay out of it, so we think. There's also natural market cycles, and there are sudden shocks that happen, sometimes referred to as black swan events. So wait a second, a Republican comes into office and all of a sudden a recession starts? Does that really make sense? Well, maybe there's some logic to it. Although sometimes Democrats completely run up the budget, after that monetary spending changes and we're seeing cuts with Doge, well, is that going to just lead us directly into a recession? And maybe one day, really long term, that there are inefficiencies that are found, and that's great and wonderful. But in the short term, is this just going to directly lead us into a recession? Because we're already struggling so much with the US economy. There was so much strain there. People were not talking about it, wasn't making headline news. Trump comes in, he's making all of these changes, and now people are starting to panic. Well, the economy was weak to begin with. There was so much strain, but people generally didn't see it until events start happening. So that being said, cuts, potentially some of them are great long-term. Obviously, some are highly unethical. Not going to talk about that, but something to definitely consider there. There's a lot here behind the scenes going on and has been going on. So looking at the data here and just looking at the facts, 1969, Nixon was president, he's a Republican. Again, 1973, we have another recession. Nixon is in office, Republican. So we have that. We have George W. Bush in 01 and 07. Again, Republican. Then February of 2020, recession started under Donald Trump. And are we going to see again during Trump's presidency another recession? I don't really like making predictions, but given how much strain there is going on in the economy, how many changes are being made, how much uncertainty there is, if you go back and look at how the Fed even talks about the economy when there's uncertainty, we're starting to see similarities that we saw of the Fed speak, as it's referred to, around the financial crisis in 07 to 09. On top of that, we have speculation. There's speculation about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and meme coins and AI, NVIDIA. If you look today, it's the 27th of February, 2025. NVIDIA was down 8%. Maybe numbers are not looking so great. And people often forget too, sometimes books are cooked, and I really would hope with NVIDIA that's not the case, because I think it would cause a lot of strain on people's money, but it's something you always need to do your due diligence and research into, because you invest a lot of money into a company like NVIDIA and you make a ton of money, but you haven't sold, and all of a sudden the market crashes 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70%. Imagine what happens to that portfolio. This is not financial advice by any means, not telling you what to do with your NVIDIA stock or whatever companies or whatever you're doing. I am just saying do your own research, because the matter of fact is that companies like NVIDIA have dropped 30 or 40% in 1 to 3 month time periods before. So rather than necessarily blaming a president or a political party, let's realize that there's more going on behind the scenes here. And when we look back to when rate hikes started in 2022, I've noticed there's typically a 12 to about 21 month lag from that time period to when we actually have seen deterioration in GDP and GDI. So this means that data that comes out for March, which really won't come out until about May or June, may start showing significant strain in the economy, may start showing that deterioration, essentially showing the average of GDP and GDI being negative. That's something you really want to look out for. Putting that aside, will we have a recession under Trump or not? Time will tell. That's really the determinant. And this video is to just share some of the facts of what's gone on and what we've seen in history over these past 8 US recessions dating back to the 1960s. So essentially 60 years worth of time. Again, regardless if you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, regardless of what country you're from, the purpose of this is to talk about that there's strain on the economy. We have seen this pattern where there have been two other presidents, Nixon and Bush, which there were two recessions under those specific presidents. So it absolutely could happen. It's not off the table. And just make sure you're prepared no matter what you do, think, believe. Do what you can to prepare for a potential crash. The other fact, too, that is interesting is that in 5 out of the last 8 US recessions, there was a Democrat in office before the Republican came in, and then there was a recession. However, before 3 of those last 8 US recessions, there was a Republican in office. What's fascinating is there's actually been no recessions over the last 8 where we've had a Democratic president and then a Democratic president, and a recession started during that Democratic president. That is super, super fascinating. And that's just a fact. In 6 out of the last 8 US recessions, when we've seen a switch in parties, so Democratic to Republican 5 times and Republican to Democrat 1 time, that is actually when we've had the most US recessions. However, Democrat to Democrat, no recessions. Republican to Republican, 2 recessions. So maybe behind the scenes here, what's going on is policies are changing so much, and maybe the government was possibly on the right track, but then different party came in, made all these changes, and the economy couldn't keep up, wasn't able to be sustained. Just an idea for thought. Again, the economy is so complex, the markets are so complex, there's so many moving factors that come into play, but what we see here is the strain is real, and it seems to be when we have a switch in presidency, more often than not, there has been a US recession throughout history. Unlike the traditional policy switch, 1994 to 1995 soft landing was where a Democratic president, Clinton, managed a slowdown without turning it into a recession. Time period today is way different. There's so much more going on. I don't even think we can compare that time period to this time period and what we've seen with rate cuts and everything else going on and all the other uncertainty. There's been so much movement in unemployment rate and inflation, specifically PCE, that NBER, the organization that declares recessions, looks at, that shows that these time periods are also not comparable from an economic standpoint. Maybe one of the biggest factors behind a recession is a switch in parties. Is the undo and changing of certain policies something that causes a recession? Your typical Republican cuts after Democrat deficits, adjustments to business and investor tax policies, uncertainty with what's going to happen seems to be a common trend. This is not to be political. I know that people are probably going to put comments anyway about it, but I just wanted to share certain facts about what's gone on throughout history when we've seen a switch between presidents, because it's overwhelmingly been an indicator of a recession. In 75% of the last 60 years, when we've seen a switch between presidents, whether that's Democratic to Republican or Republican to Democrat, we have had a US recession. So while more of that time has been Democrat to Republican, 1 instance where it was Republican to Democrat, and 2 instances where it was Republican. Again, throughout the last 60 years, we have not had a Democrat in office before the recession and then a Democrat takes over and the recession starts. But we have had 2 times, which is again really interesting, a Republican president in office and then a Republican again, and a recession has started. And then 5 out of the last 8 US recessions followed an 8-year presidency. You can argue the president makes all the difference. You can argue the president's party makes none of the difference. There's so many complex dynamics going on behind the scenes here. And I just wanted to share some really interesting and unique facts that I don't think many people often talk about recessions. But typically we do see when there's a change in parties from Democrat to Republican specifically, has been the majority of the time, is when a recession has started. And we could see this happening again with Trump in 2025, 6, 7, who knows? Is the change of political parties a coincidence or a pattern that should be understood and possibly researched further? It's so complex because you have so many moving parts. There are policies that may be undone. There are policies that may change. There are policies that may have caused a lot of damage to the economy. And there are policies that may have been great, but the new party that comes in thinks they were terrible and changes them. And that actually causes potential strain. There are so many factors that go into the economy. This is why typically I like to look at unemployment rate, inflation, PCE specifically, GDP, GDI, and only a handful of other indicators, because otherwise you can get so lost in the numbers. There are key patterns we've seen over time, and that's been regardless of who the president has been. We need to all come together. I think that's really what it comes down to. Thank you so much for listening into this. Please try not to get political in the comments. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, please click and subscribe to the channel. And if you enjoyed this video, like it, and we'll share more. This is definitely different than the normal content that I share, but I just wanted to talk about some patterns that I've seen happen.